We are going to run the country.
When people ask why the United States has focused so much attention on Venezuela, the answer is not found in one event, one crisis, or one president, but in a long chain of historical, economic, and strategic decisions that stretch back more than a century. Venezuela is not important because it is militarily powerful, and it is not important because it poses a direct security threat to the United States. It matters because of what it controls, where it is located, and what its political choices represent within the global system. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and for most of the 20th century, that fact shaped its relationship with Washington. Oil was not just an export, it was the foundation of Venezuela's economy and a pillar of U.S. energy security, especially during periods when global supply was unstable. American and European companies were deeply involved in Venezuela's oil industry, and for decades the country functioned as a reliable supplier operating within an economic framework favorable to Western interests. This arrangement fit neatly into the broader U.S. approach to Latin America, where economic access and political alignment were often treated as two sides of the same coin. For much of that period, Venezuela was viewed not as a problem, but as a success story within the U.S. sphere of influence. That relationship began to change gradually as Venezuelan leaders pushed for greater control over national resources, but the shift became unmistakable at the end of the 1990s. The election of Hugo Chavez in 1999 marked a decisive break from the past. Chavez came to power promising to reverse decades of inequality and political exclusion, and central to his project was reclaiming control over the oil industry. His government expanded state ownership, reduced the influence of foreign companies, and redirected oil revenue towards social programs. These moves were popular domestically, but deeply unsettling to U.S. policymakers and corporate interests. From Washington's perspective, this was not simply a dispute over contracts or regulations. It was a challenge to a long-standing system in which access to strategic resources had been shaped by U.S. economic and political influence. Chavez also framed his policies in openly ideological terms, presenting Venezuela as part of a broader movement resisting U.S. dominance. He criticized American foreign policy, promoted regional cooperation independent of Washington, and sought to revive ideas of Latin American sovereignty that had largely faded after the Cold War. This rhetoric mattered because it signaled that Venezuela was not just changing its internal policies, but redefining its role in the international system. Over time, Venezuela's foreign relationships reflected this shift. The country strengthened ties with Russia, China, and later Iran, not as symbolic gestures, but through concrete agreements involving arms purchases, energy development, loans, and infrastructure projects. For the United States, these relationships raised concerns that Venezuela could serve as an entry point for rival powers in a region long considered strategically vital. Latin America has historically been viewed in Washington as an area where external influence should be limited, not because of immediate military threats, but because proximity amplifies strategic risk. Venezuela's geographic position, combined with its resources, gave it significance far beyond its borders. As political tensions grew, internal divisions within Venezuela also intensified. Opposition movements challenged Chavez's authority, culminating in the brief 2002 coup attempt that removed him from power for less than 2 days before he was restored by loyal military units and mass protests. The United States denied direct involvement, but its rapid recognition of the interim government and prior contact with opposition figures reinforced Venezuelan suspicions that Washington favored regime change. From that moment on, mutual distrust hardened. Even after Chavez's death in 2013, the underlying conflict did not disappear. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited both the political system Chavez had built and an economy increasingly vulnerable to external shock. Falling oil prices, mismanagement, corruption, and structural weaknesses combined to push Venezuela into a deep economic crisis. In response, the United States escalated pressure through sanctions targeting government officials, financial institutions, and eventually the oil sector itself. Officially, these measures were framed as tools to pressure the government into restoring democratic norms and holding free elections. In practice, they significantly restricted Venezuela's ability to sell oil, access international finance, and stabilize its economy. Over time, U.S. pressure took on a more confrontational, rhetorical, and legal form. American officials publicly accused Venezuela's leadership of criminal activity and pursued indictments in U.S. courts, asserting jurisdiction over actions they argued affected U.S. national security and international law. U.S. leaders increasingly made statements suggesting decisive action against Venezuela's leadership, signaling a willingness to escalate beyond sanctions while still avoiding a traditional invasion. Supporters of U.S. policy argued that responsibility for the crisis lay primarily with Venezuela's leadership, pointing to years of poor governance and repression. Critics countered that sanctions and external pressure worsened humanitarian conditions while failing to produce meaningful political change. Regardless of where responsibility is assigned, Venezuela became a test case. It tested whether economic and legal pressure could force political transformation without direct military occupation. It tested whether control over global finance, courts, and diplomacy could substitute for traditional forms of power. It also tested how far a country could drift from U.S. influence while remaining intact. Venezuela mattered because of precedent. If a government could nationalize strategic resources, survive sanctions, maintain internal control, and deepen ties with U.S. rivals, it could encourage similar strategies elsewhere. For Washington, this raised concerns not just about Venezuela, but about the broader erosion of influence in a world becoming increasingly multipolar. The rise of China as a global economic partner, the reassertion of Russian geopolitical ambition, and the growing willingness of smaller states to diversify alliances all challenged assumptions that had guided U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War. Venezuela was not the cause of these shifts, but a visible example of them. This is why the confrontation never took the form of a traditional war. There was no sustained invasion or long-term occupation. Instead, the conflict unfolded through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, legal action, recognition disputes, and information warfare. These tools reflected a belief that influence could still be exercised without tanks or troops, even when outcomes were uncertain. That long-running pressure reached a dramatic turning point on January 3, 2026, when the United States launched a large-scale military operation against Venezuela, involving airstrikes and precision actions against key targets across the country. In public statements, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, had been captured during the operation and taken into U.S. custody. According to U.S. officials, the couple were flown out of Venezuela and transported to the United States, where federal charges, including narcotics and conspiracy counts, are expected to be pursued. The Trump administration stated that the United States would temporarily oversee governance in Venezuela while working toward a political transition, and that American energy companies would play a role in rebuilding the country's oil infrastructure. The announcement marked a significant escalation in U.S.-Venezuela relations and drew sharply divided reactions around the world. Some governments and commentators praised the operation as a decisive blow against corruption and criminal networks. Others condemned it as a violation of international law and Venezuelan sovereignty, warning that removing a sitting head of state through military force set a dangerous precedent and risked regional instability. Regardless of perspective, the event underscored how deeply Venezuela had become embedded in broader global struggles over influence, energy security, and the balance of power. What began decades earlier as economic and political divergence had now escalated into a confrontation with far-reaching implications. Venezuela remains at the intersection of energy security, regional politics, and great power competition, and that combination explains why it has remained such a persistent focus of U.S. attention. Understanding this history makes clear why the issue was never resolved by a single election, a single sanction, or a single announcement. It is not a short-term crisis, but a long-term struggle over power, influence, and the rules that govern how states interact in a changing world.